Hey guys, welcome back to the Ultimate Stepic tutorial course. In the last video, we learned about all the different sections inside the sequencer. In this video, we're going to cover what we didn't get to in the last video. So today we're going to talk about using Stepic as a polyphonic sequencer with the chord editor, meaning we can play multiple notes at the same time per step. We'll move on to the master section of all the parameters we learned about in the last video. We'll talk about retriggering our sequences and why this is useful, and finally, the different probability modes we have available to us. So underneath the green pitch sliders, we see a section with a keyboard. This is the chord editor. Here we can make chords by clicking in the notes that we want. So for this example, let's change this to D mixolydian here. And we can see that on the keyboard, some of these notes are going to be highlighted in red. The red colored notes are all the notes that fall outside of our chosen scale and are not accessible. We can, however, click this restrict to scale on the left-hand side and have access to all the notes that we want. So directly underneath each step here, we see a button called chord. Now here's where we would go to make a chord on a certain step that we'd like. So let's go try to make a chord on step 4. So we can see here that on step 4, we have this chord that we entered here. So instead of restarting the sequence every single time to listen to our chord, we can just click the top header and preview it that way. So let's make this chord progression a little bit more interesting by adding some other chords on different steps. Very cool feature of the chord editor is that all the chords that we've entered so far are stored in a pool that we can later pick from. So let's say we want to use a chord from our pool on a different step. Let's say we want to go to step 15. All we have to do is go to the master section here, and on the right hand side we can see this arrow pointing right. If we click this, we can basically scroll through all the chords that we've entered. So let's say for this last step, let's go for maybe this guy right here and see how that sounds. So now we have a sequence with a few chords in it, and we can listen to different voicings of those chords as well. So let's say we go to step 8 for this chord right over here. We want to change the voicings. So over here on the master section where it's up and down, you can click up or down to change the different voicings in a higher pitch or a lower pitch. So let's check this one on a lower pitch by hitting this one time and see how that sounds. See how that sounds in our sequence. And we can also raise it up, maybe one more. So this is useful if we have a chord progression that we'd like and we just want to change the voicings of our chords, giving us a little bit of a different sound. In the master section of the chord editor, we can also click the recycle button to reset our steps to just one note and remove the notes that we added in the chord editor. So let's say we don't like 15, we can go back over here and then hit recycle, and it goes back to our regular step. Definitely very cool. We can also quickly copy chords to and from different steps via the quick copy buttons in the master section. So let's say if we wanted to copy steps 4 chord to steps 2 and 5, all we have to go is go to step 4 and then go 2 and then select 2 and 5 and then hit copy, and then now we have steps 2 and 5 with the exact same chord. Or we can select copy from a different step. So we can go from 9 and say copy from, and maybe we want step 8. And then there we go. Step 8 and 9 are now going to be identical. Another very cool feature about the chord editor is that the green pitch sliders will affect our chords by transposing them. Let's delete this pattern here, go back down here to D mixolydian, and then on our first chord, let's go something kind of like this, and change our master steps down to about 12. Now on our copy settings, we can go to 2, and then we go 3, 5, 7, and 9, and hit copy. So now we have all these different chords copied to these different steps. So what we can do here is on step 3, we can increase this pitch slider by 1, and we see that these chords are now transposed, and we can do this the whole time here, and take a listen to this. And we can also see that this is confirmed in the MIDI drag and drop here on our piano roll, doing exactly that. In each section of Stepic sequencer, there are groups of multiple buttons on the right-hand side. These are the master controls that pertain to each section. So one of Stepic's strengths is the consistency, meaning that once we learn how these main controls work in one section of Stepic, the same concepts will also work in the other sections with only a few slight differences. So the first area I want to bring your attention to is the group of yellow buttons at the very top right of Stepic. This can be thought of as the main master section in Stepic. So let's look at the yellow dice here. Once we click this, this is going to randomize every single section in Stepic, as we can see with velocity, swing, divider, and note repeat as well. Now, some of these buttons have a slightly different functionality if we right-click them. In this case, if we right-click this right here, the same button, it's going to also add step randomization as well. To the right of the yellow dice is the reset button. If we left click this, it'll reset all of our values back to their defaults. If we right click this, it will also reset the values to their defaults, but it'll keep this per step randomness. So let's take a look at that right here by right clicking this. And we can see that the per step randomness is still applied. We can go ahead and randomize once again. And if we want to reset everything, we just left click on the reset button. And there we go, back to our default value. Next up, we have the left and the right arrows. The job of these two buttons is to move the steps either to the left or to the right. If we left click, it will shift the steps either left or right, depending on which button we click. But if we right click on these, it'll move the steps left and right, but it'll keep the per step randomness on the step it was applied to. So let's go ahead and right click this randomness here. So we have some random values here, and then we also have some random step values. Now, if you left click on this left and right here, we can also see how everything is moving left and right. However, if we right-click, we can see that the per step randomness is still applied. On sections with sliders, we have additional buttons that point up and down. These will raise or lower the values in their respective sections. The only real difference between left-clicking or right-clicking is the distance each button will move those sliders. So right-clicking will generally give you smaller movements. And this is kind of useful. For example, let's go ahead and dial the D-mixolydian, something kind of like this. And maybe let's just kind of do on-the-fly stuff like this for our pitch, and then maybe do that as well for our duration, and also for our velocity, something kind of like that. So it's a little bit random here, and go ahead and play this here. So these up and down can be useful if we want to bring everything up and keep the ratio the same. So that's kind of cool right there. And same with the velocity. Let's say we kind of like this, but it's a little bit too much. We can always just bring these down a little bit like that, and these will all keep their same ratio. And same goes for duration. Maybe these are kind of a little bit too much. We can always just bring these down a little bit. Or if it's just a little too much, that's where we want to right click and do some fine adjustments there. And the same thing goes with the swing, divider, and the note repeat as well. So each section here inside the sequencer has its own quick copy function. Here we can easily copy any work that we've done to other patterns without having to rebuild everything that we've done. The quick copy here at the top of Stepic will copy all the stuff inside the sequencer. But let's say, for example, we make a random pitch sequence right here, and we want to copy this only to a couple other patterns. We click here to the quick copy, and let's say we want to go 2, 3, and 4. We hit copy, and we can see that 2, 3, and 4 have been copied to the other patterns. Directly to the left of the master quick copy is the MIDI export. Here we can export all of our sequencers MIDI directly into the piano roll. This is very similar as what we showed in the video where we discussed the top bar. The difference here is that this exports the sequencer MIDI and not the automation programmed in the automation tab. By default, Stepic will play its sequencer in a consecutive order, meaning it will start on step 1 and continue to the end and restart. We can change this behavior and have Stepic play its steps in a random order by clicking the gray dice button directly to the right of the step counter. The dice will now turn green and the steps will be played in a random order, but if we click the step more than once, it turns purple. Purple also activates the random play order of the steps. The difference here is that the green dice has the possibility of triggering the same step it just previously played, whereas the purple dice will not allow identical consecutive steps to be played. Here's why something like this could be useful. Let's bring our master steps down to 3, change our note length here down to 1/4. Let's turn this on purple, pick a couple different notes, and let's see how this sounds. So here we can see that we get a different note on each step. If we were to set this to green, we would get repeated notes. So let's keep this on purple, bring our octave step count to about 5, something kind of like this. And on step 4, let's bring this up octave 1, something kind of like that. And then increase our clock to 1/16 and take a listen to see how this sounds. So even just using 3 different notes with a purple dice and changing the octave by 1, we get a very organic sequence that doesn't feel too repetitive. Another thing you can do with random step order is to introduce a controlled randomness. Here we have all 16 steps in use, and let's aim to keep the majority of our steps on the root note. Let's set steps 13 and 14 to F sharp, and we can see that down here on the note icon. So steps 13 and 14, F sharp, and 15 and 16 are going to be A, and let's set this to random. So this is an interesting way to use Stepic because out of 16 total steps, there is a 2 out of 16 chance the note will either be an F sharp or an A, and 12 out of 16 chance for the note to be our root note. We can make another small adjustment if we want to make this a little bit more interesting. So let's set the octave random play order and let's increase the step 16 by 1 octave here and see how that sounds. So in this case, we have 1 out of 16 chance for one of our notes to go up by 1 octave. Definitely a cool way to use this feature. You may have seen lock icons appear in Stepic when we hover our mouse over the different sections. Now, when we click on the lock, it will prevent that value from being randomized every time we hit the dice button. This is useful if we only want to randomize a few things in our sequence while keeping other parameters locked to the values that we set. Now, there's a few different ways we can go about locking parameters. We can hover our mouse over the certain parameter and left click and it will lock that value. We can also right click and it will do all of these horizontally. Now, this is useful if we want to lock everything down and only unlock a few things to randomize. So something kind of like this here. Let's go ahead and reset all this here. Another way we can do this is we can find a lock that we want to start from and then left click and then drag to lock a certain different amount here. So we can lock these here and then start randomizing from there. And finally, if we want to lock an entire step with all of its parameters, we can go up here to the header and this lock icon up here. We go ahead and select that here. Now all of these parameters will be locked and we can even go ahead and randomize everything like this. And we can see that this first value, even for duration, velocity, swing, divider, and note repeat, all keep the locked value. Below the green and purple dice is the Retrigger button. This option determines how the sequence will be restarted. The yellow Retrigger option will restart the section sequence when a bar has completed, and the blue Retrigger option will restart that section sequence when a pattern has completed. It's important to remember that if a pattern's bar count is not greater than 1, both yellow and blue options will give the same result. So yellow restarts after each bar and blue after the entire pattern is finished. Retrigger can help make a sequence feel a little bit more rhythmical, while different sequencer parameters are set to various and odd values. So let's set our on-off steps to 1, our pitch to maybe about 7, our octaves here to about 6, and then our duration to 1. Let's turn Retrigger on our pitch and on our octave, and then let's select a couple different notes here from our pitch that we like. And then for the first step on our octave, let's put this on 1. So do you notice how once the sequence gets to the end of the 16, the pitch and the octaves will restart? So here we have a nice sounding, uneven sequence, but it brings rhythm into the chaos. And if we listen to this without Retrigger and see the difference, it's going to be a little something like this. So here it still sounds good, but we lose a little bit of the sense of rhythm and repetition because the notes are basically all over the place. Whereas with Retrigger, the first octave slider really helps our brains understand that the sequence has been restarted. So let's reactivate Retrigger and notice how that rhythm comes back. Now, if we set our bar count to 2 and change both retrigger options to blue, let's check out that right over here. So 2-bar count, both of these are going to be blue, and then we're going to see how the sequence will be restarted after the second bar completes. So when we use the retrigger options in conjunction with polyrhythms, it can really help take our sequences to the next level. So now let's talk about Stepic's probability modes. In the very top right of Stepic, where we see the orange button called Rand, this button has to do with the on, con, and off section that we talked about earlier on in the course. If we were to select the dice right next to the on button, every time a step is triggered, we get a random chance of it being on, con, or connected, or off. Basically, a roll of the dice will determine which value we get out of those three choices. Now, if we click on this Rand button, this is going to change into a percentage symbol, and we see that the dice that was previously there has now changed into a 0 with a ring around it. This allows us to set probability, but only with the values of on or off. So for example, let's say our step is set to on and our probability is at 0. This means that the step has 0 probability of triggering off. So now let's bring our master steps to 4 and then our clock speed to 1/8. And on this first step, if we set this probability to 25, we're going to have a 25% chance of this first step triggering off. So let's also raise the first octave so it's kind of obvious once that note hits, and take a listen to see how something like this sounds. The opposite is also true, meaning that if we manually set the step to off and the probability is still at 25%, that step has 25% chance of turning on. And finally, we have fix. The knobs will look the same as the percent sign, but the functionality is very different. When fix is selected, the knobs give us a range from either 0 or 2 through 8. These numbers will determine at what cycle of the sequence it takes for the steps to trigger its value of on or off. So for example, on the first step, let's bring this up by 1 octave here and make sure the step is toggled on. And for the fixed amount, let's go to 2, and let's bring our steps all the way down to maybe about 4 and take a listen here. So on the second cycle, it will trigger the step to off and won't play a note. In this case, the step basically alternates between on and off as the sequence cycles over and over. If we change the value to 3, then the third cycle, it will trigger the step to off. So let's check that out. Let's bring this down a little bit slower so we can kind of see what's going on here. So the reverse is also true. If we have the step turned off manually and set the fixed value to 2, then the first time it plays, it will remain off, but the second cycle, it will trigger to on and the note will be played. So here's why these different modes can be really cool, especially when we set our master steps to low values. So in this case, let's bring our master steps down to about 4. And then for the step 3 and 4, we're going to change this over to fix and then go to 2 for step 3. And then for 4, we're going to go to about 3 and take a listen to this here. So here we only have 4 steps, but using fix in this case gives us a really cool rhythmic pattern, and we can make this even a little bit more cool by adding an octave here on the 4th step and enabling the green dice here for the random step order. And we can always drop this down an octave and see what that sounds like down over here. So now let's check this out with the percent here on a master step count of 8. So let's bring this up to 8 and then go over here to the randomness here, or the percentage. So for step 3, what we can do is maybe bring this up to about 45, and then same thing for step 5. So we're giving a probability of 45% for steps 3 and 5, and let's see how this sounds. So here, instead of a predictive rhythmic cycle like we saw in the fixed mode, we're using probability to introduce rhythm, but on a more random basis. So definitely give these modes a try and you'll see for yourself how cool they really are. In the next part of the course, we're going to talk about the MIDI play button on the top bar of Stepic, where we can make really cool and advanced arpeggios, transposition options, chord play, and much, much more. So thank you so much for watching. I hope you learned something, and we'll see you in the next video.